The hiss of the bus doors was the first sound of her day that truly mattered. It was a sigh of release, expelling her from the anonymous crush of Tokyo's morning commute into the crisp, manicured air of the city's most affluent district. Lena stepped onto the pavement, the worn strap of her tote bag digging a familiar groove into her shoulder. Across the street, behind a formidable wall of gray stone and shadowed cypress trees, was the estate. Her destination. Every morning was the same. The 7:14 a.m. bus, the brief walk across the quiet street, the silent nod to the guard at the gate who never spoke but whose eyes followed her every step. She worked for a premium cleaning service, one that vetted its employees with the rigor of a government agency. Their clients were the unseen titans of industry, the quiet billionaires, the ones who valued discretion above all else. Lena was good at her job because she understood the core principle: become invisible. She was a ghost who polished silver and erased footprints, leaving behind only the scent of lemon oil and the gleam of impossibly clean surfaces. The house itself was a contradiction, a fortress of modern architecture. All glass and steel and severe angles that felt as ancient and imposing as a shogun's castle. Inside, the silence was a living thing. It had weight and texture. Her job was to move through it without disturbance. For months, she had done just that, learning the geography of the house like the back of her hand. The west wing that caught the morning light, the library where the air always smelled of old paper and cedar, the vast, empty ballroom where her soft-soled shoes were the only sound. She rarely saw the owner, Mr. Tanaka. He was a whisper, a shadow. A suit seen from a distance, the low murmur of a voice from behind a closed door. The other staff, the cook and the groundskeeper, spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. They called him Tanaka-sama when they thought she wasn't listening, a title of deep respect that felt heavier than a simple honorific. Lena just called him the client.
It was safer that way.
Today, her assignment was the master study on the second floor. It was a room she both dreaded and was fascinated by. It overlooked the front of the estate, the stone wall, the quiet street, and the small park with the bus stop where her day began and ended. The room was stark, masculine. A massive desk of polished black oak, shelves of books bound in dark leather, and a single, breathtaking wall of floor-to-ceiling glass. She began her work, her movements economical and practiced, dusting the severe lines of the desk, carefully wiping down the collection of antique ink pots. As she worked, she felt it, the prickle on the back of her neck that signaled she was not alone. She stilled, her hand frozen over a leather-bound volume. Slowly she turned. He was standing by the window, his back to her, looking out at the park below. It was him, Mr. Tanaka. She had never been this close to him before. He wasn't a shadow or a whisper. He was a solid, immovable presence. He wore a suit of charcoal gray so exquisitely tailored it seemed molded to his frame. He was perfectly still, a predator conserving its energy, and the sheer force of his stillness made the air in the room feel thin. Lena's training kicked in. Be invisible. Apologize for the intrusion.
Leave.
But her feet wouldn't move. She was trapped by the sight of him. He wasn't looking at the park in general. His focus was sharp, narrowed on the bus stop. Her bus stop. He was watching the spot where she stood every morning, waiting for the 7:14. The realization was a cold drop of water down her spine. How long had he been watching? As if sensing her thoughts, he spoke without turning. His voice was low, a gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. You are punctual. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. He knew her routine. Lena's mouth went dry. I believe it's important, sir. He made a soft sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. Then he turned. She had expected an older man, someone with the softened edges of immense wealth. But he was younger than she'd thought, perhaps in his late 30s. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a face carved from granite and shadow. His eyes were the darkest brown she had ever seen, intelligent and utterly devoid of warmth. And then she saw it, the detail that made everything else click into a terrifying sort of sense. Peeking from the crisp, white collar of his shirt, just above the knot of his silk tie, was a splash of deep, intricate color. The scales of a dragon, tattooed in shades of indigo and black, curling up the side of his neck. This was no titan of industry. This was something else entirely. Something dangerous. Before she could process the thought, a flicker of movement outside the window caught her eye. Down in the park, a man in a dark coat was sitting on the bench near the bus stop. Another man approached him. Their exchange was brief, tense. Lena saw a glint of metal pass between them. Then, a third man appeared, moving with a swift, brutal efficiency. He was on the second man in an instant. There was no sound that reached the study, but Lena saw the flash of a blade, a spray of crimson against the green grass, and the second man crumpled to the ground. The first man was already gone. The attacker vanished back into the trees. It was over in less than 5 seconds. A silent, surgical execution, right where she stood every single day. Lena gasped, stumbling back, her hand flying to her mouth. The metallic taste of fear flooded her senses. Mr. Tanaka, Kaido, she would learn his name was Kaido, had not moved. His expression was unchanged, his gaze fixed on the scene below. He had watched a man die with the detached interest of someone watching a nature documentary. "It seems your punctuality has just become a liability," he said, his voice as cold and calm as the glass window. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were not just dark, they were bottomless. You saw his face. Again, not a question. A statement. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She couldn't speak, could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. "Then you will not be taking the bus home today," he said. He reached for a phone on his desk and pressed a single button. "Secure the house. Our cleaning staff will be extending her stay indefinitely." 2 of his men, dressed in the same severe black suits, entered the study so silently she hadn't heard the door open. They stood on either side of the doorway, their presence blocking the only exit. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them, the sound of the lock engaging echoing in the vast, silent room. It was the sound of a caged door closing. Lena stared at Kaido, at the man who owned this house, this silence, and now her. She was no longer a ghost in his home. She was a prisoner. And she had the terrible feeling that her life, the one with the 7:14 bus and the simple, invisible routine, had just been murdered as neatly and efficiently as the man in the park. The first 24 hours were a lesson in absolute control. Lena was escorted not to a dungeon, but to a guest suite that was larger and more luxurious than her entire apartment. It had silk sheets, a marble bathroom, and a closet filled with clothes in her size. It was a beautiful, terrifying cage. The window was reinforced, the door locked from the outside. Her phone was gone. Her tote bag, with her keys and her wallet, was gone. Her old life had been surgically removed. She learned his name was Kaido from the cook, a stern older woman named Mrs. Sato, who brought her meals on a tray and refused to meet her eyes. She spoke of him with a mixture of fear and devotion that Lena was beginning to understand. Kaido was not a man you disappointed. He came to see her that first evening. He didn't knock. The lock simply clicked open and he was there, filling the doorway. He carried a tray himself, setting it down on a small table. It held a bowl of steaming broth and a pot of tea. "You must eat," he said. It was an order. Lena stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself. "What do you want from me?" "For now? Your memory," he said, his voice flat. "The face you saw. It belongs to a man from the Inagawa clan, a rival organization. They are testing my territory. They have become bold." "Organization," Lena repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You mean the Yakuza?" He didn't confirm or deny it. He simply watched her, his dark eyes assessing her reaction. He was looking for hysterics, for tears, for pleading. Lena gave him none of it. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but on the surface, she was still. She had learned long ago that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. "They will be looking for you," he continued. "The only civilian witness. They will assume you work for me, or that you will talk to the police. Either way, You are a loose end they will want to tie, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the silent room. Out there, you are a target. In here, you are under my protection. Protection? Lena's voice was sharp with disbelief. This is a prison. A flicker of something, not amusement, but something close to it, passed through his eyes. The most dangerous prisons are the ones you do not see. You are safer in this room than you have been at any point in the last year.
Eat.
He left as silently as he had arrived. Lena stared at the food. She knew it was a test of compliance, a test of will. With deliberate movements, she sat down and ate every last bite. If she was going to survive this, she needed her strength. She would play his game, but she would do it on her own terms. Days bled into a week. Her world shrank to the four walls of the suite. Kaido was her only point of contact with the outside world, his visits brief and unnervingly quiet. He would bring her books from the library or simply stand by the window, watching the street below as he had that first day. In these tense, silent moments, Lena began to watch him, too. She noticed the way he moved, with a lethal grace that was all contained power. She saw the calluses on his knuckles when he set down a teacup. She learned the scent of his cologne, a clean, sharp fragrance of sandalwood and smoke that lingered in the air long after he was gone. He never touched her, but his presence was a physical weight, a constant pressure. One afternoon, a different kind of sound shattered the mansion's oppressive silence. A sharp crack from outside, followed by another. Gunshots. Lena's heart leaped into her throat. Shouts erupted from the grounds below. She rushed to the window, pressing herself against the cold glass. Two black sedans were stopped outside the main gate, men with guns taking cover behind them, firing at the house. Her door burst open. It wasn't Kaido, but two of his guards. Come with us.
Now.
They rushed her down a hallway she'd never seen before, into the heart of the house. The air was thick with the smell of cordite. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with Kaido. He was holding a pistol, his movements calm and precise as he directed his men. He looked at her, his eyes sweeping over her to ensure she was unharmed. The look was brief, impersonal, but it felt like a brand. Get her to the safe room, he ordered, his voice cutting through the chaos. He didn't wait for response, turning to fire 2 shots down the corridor. He moved like a dancer in a world of violence. Lena was shoved into a small, windowless room hidden behind a tapestry. The door was solid steel, and it slid shut with a heavy, final thud, plunging her into near darkness. The sounds of the fight were muffled, distant. Alone in the dark, the reality of her situation crashed down on her. This wasn't a corporate dispute. This was a war, and she was standing in the middle of it. The silence that eventually fell was more terrifying than the noise. Hours passed. Lena sat on the cold floor, knees drawn to her chest, waiting. When the door finally slid open, Kaido stood there. His suit was torn at the shoulder, and a dark stain was spreading across his white shirt, but he seemed otherwise unharmed. He didn't speak, just looked at her. Are you all right? The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. He seemed surprised by the question, as if the concept of his own well-being was foreign. They were repelled, he said, which wasn't an answer. He held out a hand.
Come.
She hesitated for only a second before taking it. His hand was warm, the grip firm and sure. He led her back through the now quiet hallways. His men were cleaning up, their movements efficient and grim. There were bodies. She forced herself to look away. He didn't take her back to her suite.
He took her to his.
It was as stark and controlled as the rest of the house, dominated by a large bed and another wall of glass overlooking the city lights. They know I have a witness, he said, his back to her as he stared out at the sprawling metropolis. They attacked to retrieve you. They failed. They will try again. So what happens now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Now you are no longer just a witness, he said, turning to face her. His gaze was intense, pinning her in place. You are a symbol. You are the piece of my territory they tried to take, and could not. You are mine to protect. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. He was claiming her, not as a lover, but as a possession, a fortress he would not allow to be breached. In that moment, Lena realized the lock on her door had not been the real prison. The real prison was his protection, and it was one from which she could never escape. The attack changed the texture of her confinement. She was moved from the guest suite to a room adjoining Kaito's. The pretense of her being a temporary guest was gone. She was now a permanent fixture in the heart of his fortress. The invisible walls around her had drawn tighter, but paradoxically, she had more freedom within them. She was allowed into the library, the kitchen, the serene inner garden with its koi pond and meticulously raked gravel. Always, a silent guard was nearby, but Kaito seemed to have decided that a bird in a larger cage was still a bird in a cage. It was during this time that she discovered the room. It was on the third floor, a part of the house she had never been assigned to clean. The door was unlocked. Curiosity, a dangerous impulse in this house, got the better of her. She pushed it open. The room was an artist's studio. Dust motes danced in the single beam of afternoon light slanting through a skylight. A large canvas stood on an easel, a painting of a storm-tossed sea half-finished. Pots of brushes stood on a nearby table, the paint in them long dried. The air smelled faintly of turpentine and linseed oil. It was a space frozen in time, a memory preserved under a thin layer of dust. On a small desk, a photograph in a simple silver frame showed a smiling woman with paint smudged on her cheek, her eyes bright and full of life. Her name was Akari. Kaito's voice came from the doorway. Lena spun around, her heart hammering. He wasn't angry. His expression was hollow, his eyes fixed on the unfinished painting. She was a painter, he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. She saw beauty in chaos. She thought she could find it in my world, too. He walked into the room, his hand ghosting over the back of a wooden chair. She was careless. She left the estate without a guard, believing no one would dare touch her. The Inagawa clan took her.
It was a message to me.
A warning. He finally looked at Lena, and for the first time, she saw not the cold Yakuza boss, but a man haunted by a profound failure. I paid their price, but they sent her back. In pieces. My pride prevented me from protecting her. That is a shame I will carry forever. That was his wound. The crack in his armor. It wasn't just about a woman he'd lost. It was about the failure of his control, a breach in the absolute power he cultivated. He, who controlled everything, had failed to protect the one person who had seen something other than a monster in him. Understanding dawned on Lena. His obsession with her safety, with keeping her locked away, wasn't just about protecting a witness. It was about exorcising the ghost of Akari. He would not fail again. A few days later, the opportunity she had been dreaming of for weeks presented itself. A new shipment of supplies was being delivered to the kitchen. In the confusion of boxes and personnel, the service entrance was left unguarded for a full 90 seconds. Lena saw it from the garden. Freedom was a straight line across a paved driveway.
Run.
The single word screamed in her mind. Her body tensed, ready to bolt. But she thought of the unfinished painting. She thought of the hollow look in Kaito's eyes. And she thought of the men who had shot at the house, who were looking for her. Running wasn't freedom. It was a death sentence. But there was another thought, a more complicated one. She saw a black van parked half a block down from the service entrance, a vehicle that didn't belong, one she'd noticed making slow passes all morning. She didn't run. She walked, calmly and deliberately, back into the house. She found Kaito in his study. He looked up from his papers, a questioning arch to his eyebrow. "There is a black van," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Parked at the end of the street. It's been there all morning. I think they're watching the service entrance." He didn't question her. He didn't ask how she knew. He simply stared at her for a long, silent moment. The air in the room grew thick, charged with an unspoken current. He rose from his desk and walked toward her until he was standing only a foot away. The scent of sandalwood and smoke was overwhelming. "You could have run," he said, his voice a low rumble. I know, she replied, her gaze unwavering. He was so close she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. He lifted a hand, as if to touch her cheek, but stopped, his fingers hovering in the air between them. The moment stretched, filled with a tension that was more intimate than any touch. It was a silent acknowledgement. She had chosen. She had picked a side. She had chosen his cage over the illusion of freedom. Thank you, he whispered, the words so soft she almost didn't hear them. It was an admission of something far greater than gratitude. It was an admission of trust. And in his world, trust was more precious and more dangerous than any currency. Her warning about the van prevented an ambush. Kaido's men intercepted it, confirming it was an Inagawa surveillance team. The incident shifted Lena's status again. She was no longer just a protected liability. She was an asset, an observer. Kaido started bringing her into his study during meetings with his top lieutenants. She would sit in a chair in the corner, silent, while they discussed strategy. He said her perspective, that of an outsider, was valuable. But Lena knew it was more than that. He was keeping her close. He was testing her. One evening, he spread a series of photographs across the polished surface of his desk. They were grainy surveillance shots of different men. Here, he said, his voice all business. The man you saw in the park. Is he one of them? Lena's hands felt cold. This was different from warning him about a van. This was pointing a finger. This was signing a death warrant. She studied the faces, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Then she saw him, the man with the blade. His eyes were empty, his mouth a cruel slash. There was no doubt. She placed a single, trembling finger on the photo. That's him. Kaido looked at the picture, his expression unreadable. He picked up his phone and spoke to his second-in-command. His Japanese was swift and cold. Lena didn't need to understand the language to comprehend the order. The tone was universal. It was a sentence of death, delivered as calmly as if he were ordering dinner. Find him, Kaido said, switching to English for her benefit, his eyes locked on hers. And find everyone who shares his blood. This insult must be wiped from the ledger. The casual brutality of it stole her breath. His entire family. This wasn't a war between soldiers. It was an eradication. This was the man who brought her tea, the man who carried a ghost in his heart. He was also a monster who ordered the death of families without a flicker of emotion. She should have been horrified. She should have run screaming. And a part of her was. But another, darker part of her, a part she hadn't known existed, felt a cold, grim satisfaction. They had tried to kill her. They had dragged her into this. Kaido was simply finishing it. The Inagawa clan's response was swift and furious. They didn't bother with surveillance this time. They launched a full-scale assault on the mansion, a desperate, vengeful strike. The attack came at night. Explosions rocked the foundation of the house. Alarms blared. Kaido burst into her room, grabbing her arm. We have to move. He pulled her through the chaos. Gunfire echoed in the halls, plaster raining from the ceiling. He was a shield, his body constantly between her and the direction of the fighting. As they reached the main staircase, a group of Inagawa soldiers appeared at the top. Kaido shoved her behind him, firing with deadly accuracy. In the flash of the muzzle, she saw a brief, agonizing pain cross his face as a bullet grazed his side. He didn't slow down. He forced her toward the hidden safe room. Get inside, he yelled over the din. No, you're hurt, she cried, seeing the crimson seeping through his jacket. Go. He pushed her into the opening, his eyes burning with a desperate intensity. As the heavy steel door began to slide shut, she saw him turn back toward the fight, a lone king defending his castle. The door closed, sealing her in with the terrifying certainty that she had just seen him for the last time. The thought was a physical agony, a hollow scoop in her chest. Inside the safe room, she wasn't helpless. She remembered her first time in here, the feeling of utter powerlessness.
Not this time.
Her eyes scanned the small space, landing on a security panel she hadn't noticed before. She touched the screen, and it flickered to life, showing a dozen camera feeds from around the estate. She watched the battle unfold, her hands clenched into fists. She saw Kaido fighting with a cold, focused rage. And then she saw something else. On a feed showing a rear maintenance tunnel, a passage she knew from her cleaning routes, a lone Nagawa soldier was trying to escape. He was limping, wounded, but he was getting away. There was a comms unit next to the monitor. Without a second's hesitation, Lena picked it up. She didn't know who she was speaking to, but she knew they were Kaido's men. "Rear maintenance tunnel," she said, her voice low and clear, disguising its pitch. "One hostile, moving west." She put the comms down, her heart pounding. She had just crossed a line she could never uncross. She had actively participated. She had become an accessory, a piece on the board, a monster of a different kind. Hours later, the door slid open. Kaido stood there, leaning against the frame. He was covered in dust and blood, his face pale with exhaustion, but he was alive. He looked at her and he knew. He didn't ask how she'd known about the tunnel. His eyes held hers. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, his voice rough. Lena met his gaze, the terror and the adrenaline and the strange, fierce possessiveness all churning inside her. The lie she'd been telling herself, that she was just a victim, a survivor, crumbled into dust. "I told myself staying here was about survival," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I was lying to myself." It was a confession, not of love, but of something far more complex and dangerous. It was an admission of allegiance, an acknowledgement that her fate was now inextricably tied to his. He took a step into the room, closing the distance between them. He reached out and cupped her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. His touch was not gentle, but it was possessive. "A claim. The Inagawa clan now knows who you are," he said, his voice a dark promise. "They know my witness has a name. They will not stop until they have you." He paused, his gaze dropping to her lips. "Let them try." The threat was no longer just against his empire. It was against her. And standing there, in the heart of the wreckage, Lena felt not fear, but the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of being the most important piece in the game. The war was over. Kaido had won. The Inagawa clan was shattered, its leaders either dead or in hiding. The silence that returned to the mansion was different now. It was not the silence of peace, but the quiet of a graveyard after a battle. Lena's life found a new, strange rhythm. She was no longer a prisoner, but she was not free either. She was something else, a fixture in Kaido's world, the queen of a gilded cage. Kaido knew the remaining splinters of the Inagawa clan would be desperate. Desperate men were predictable. He received a message, a single photo of Lena sent to a burner phone. The implication was clear. They knew her face, and they would make one last attempt. Not to kill him, but to take her. To inflict upon him the same shame he carried for Akari. "They will try to take you in public," Kaido explained, standing with her before the wall of glass in his study. The city lights glittered below like a carpet of scattered diamonds. "They need to humiliate me. There is a restaurant, the Azure, in Shinjuku. Neutral ground. The new head of the clan, a fool named Ryota, will attempt to meet me there under the guise of a truce." "And you're going to walk into a trap?"
Lena asked.
"No," Kaido said, turning to face her. "We are." The plan was simple. She would be his bait. She would sit at his table, a visible symbol of his victory, daring them to make a move. His men would be everywhere, hidden, waiting. Lena felt a cold knot of fear, but she nodded. She had crossed her line. There was no going back. The Azure was the height of opulent minimalism. Soft lighting, hushed conversations, the clink of ice in crystal glasses. Lena wore a simple black dress Kaido had chosen for her, the fabric a soft whisper against her skin. She felt the eyes of everyone in the restaurant on them as Kaido led her to a secluded table. He moved through the room like he owned it, a predator at ease in a curated jungle. Ryota arrived, flanked by 2 guards who stayed by the entrance. He was younger than Kaido, his arrogance a thin veneer over a core of insecurity. He sat, his eyes flicking to Lena, a smug, possessive look on his face. The conversation was tense, a dance of veiled threats and false promises. Lena sat in silence, her senses on high alert. She felt the trap coiling, but something was wrong. This was too simple, too obvious. Then she saw it. Ryota wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze was fixed on a table across the room, where a well-dressed couple was finishing their meal. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. One of his men at the door moved, not toward their table, but toward the couple. In one fluid motion, he pulled a gun and pressed it to the woman's temple. The restaurant fell silent. "A change of plans, Tanaka," Ryota sneered. "Your witness for this innocent woman. A simple trade. Or my man will redecorate the walls. Your choice." Kaito's face was a mask of cold fury. His men were out of position, blocked by the layout of the room. Any move they made would get the hostage killed. He was trapped. Lena's mind raced. They had planned for a direct assault on her, not this. Panic was a rising tide, but she pushed it down. She remembered Kaito's words, "Be an asset, not a liability." She saw a waiter hovering nearby, a tray with a steaming teapot in his hands. An idea, insane and desperate, bloomed in her mind. She had to create a diversion. A split second of chaos. She stood up abruptly, making it look like she was stumbling in fear. She bumped into the waiter's tray, sending it flying. The ceramic teapot crashed onto Ryota's table, shattering. Scalding hot tea splashed across his hand and lap. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, instinctively recoiling. It was all Kaito needed. In that single second of distraction, Kaito moved. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a blur of violence. He kicked the table, sending it crashing into Ryota's chest. In the same motion, he drew his pistol. A single, muffled shot echoed through the room. The man holding the hostage dropped, a neat hole in his forehead. Kaito's men converged, subduing Ryota and his remaining guard before anyone could even scream. It was over. Lena stood amidst the wreckage, her body trembling with adrenaline. She hadn't been rescued. She had created the opening. She had acted. Back in the silent mansion, the danger was finally, truly gone. The last threat had been neutralized. Kaito poured 2 glasses of whiskey, his movements steady. He had a long, shallow cut on his cheekbone from a piece of flying porcelain. He handed her a glass. He stood before her, his dark eyes searching her face. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Akari was my shame," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "She represented a failure of my strength. A past I could not control." He paused, his thumb brushing against her lower lip.
You are my discipline.
You are the strength I choose to protect. You remind me what is worth holding." It was not a declaration of love. It was something deeper, something forged in violence and fear and choice. It was an acknowledgement, a claiming. The cost of that claim was everything she had been. The woman who rode the 714 bus was gone forever. Her small apartment, her quiet life, her invisibility, they were ghosts of a past that no longer belonged to her. She had chosen this world of beautiful, dangerous shadows. Later that night, she stood at the window of his study, looking out at the park across the street. The bus stop was empty, bathed in the orange glow of a street lamp. It looked like a scene from someone else's life. She heard him approach, felt his presence settle behind her, a familiar weight in the silence. He didn't touch her, but stood so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. He placed something on the polished wooden windowsill beside her hand. A single, ornate key.
"This is your home now, Lena," he said.
It wasn't a question. It was a statement of absolute fact. She looked at the key, its intricate metalwork gleaming in the dim light. It was not the key to a cage. It was the key to an empire. His empire. Theirs. She looked from the key to the distant, lonely bus stop, the last relic of her old world. A choice made. A life claimed. She didn't reach for the key. Not yet. The dawn was coming, and with it, the The first day of her new, brutal, and beautiful life. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the sound of a kingdom settling around its queen.